Guys, let's look at preparation of insoluble salts. Specifically, we look at barium sulfate as an example of an insoluble salt that we are going to use as an example for this lesson. Now, you should know that for you to prepare barium sulfate, the method of preparation is precipitation. Okay, method of preparation is precipitation. Okay, now look at this. The equation, the format is, for you to prepare an insoluble salt, you need to have a soluble solution reacting with another soluble solution to form an insoluble solution and a soluble solution. So you have 3 soluble solutions and 1 insoluble. Mostly when preparing barium sulfate or an insoluble salt, nitrate solution is there, and sodium solution also is supposed to be there. So when it comes to reactants in preparation of barium sulfate, we need to have a nitrate. So we have barium nitrate, and an insoluble, a soluble solution, usually sodium sulfate, because remember we have barium sulfate, so one of the reactants should have a sulfate, okay, and the other one should have a barium. So usually barium nitrate and sodium sulfate. Now you can use sodium sulfate or sulfuric acid, H2SO4, or sulfuric acid, okay, or sulfuric acid, because we have sulfate here. Now what will be formed will be barium sulfate, and sodium nitrate, and sodium nitrate. To write this one as a chemical equation, it will be barium nitrate, barium nitrate, which will be, barium has a valence of 2 because it's in group 2, so it will be barium nitrate. Nitrate is a radical and has a valence of 1, so barium, the 2 will be this side, okay, reacting with the sodium sulfate. Sodium is in group 1, sulfate is a radical, so the 2 will be here, so it's a radical with a valence of 2, so the 2 will be here and will be like this, sodium sulfate, to form barium sulfate. Barium sulfate also has a valence of 2, so it will be ASO4, and sodium nitrate. Now just NaNO3, because sodium is in group 1 and has the valence of 1. Nitrate has a valence of 1 as well. Now when it comes to state symbols, since these are all also solutions, this will be in aqueous, this also aqueous, but barium sulfate will be a solid, and this one will be in aqueous form. Now the ionic equation will be, for you to produce barium sulfate, we use positive cations and anions. So for you to come up with barium sulfate, we are using barium 2 plus, okay, which is reacting. Let's balance it first before we even proceed. Okay, let's check if it's balanced. Barium, you have 1. This side you have 1. Nitrate, no, nitrogen 2. Nitrogen here. Nitrogen this side 1. So we are going to put a 2 here so that also nitrogen balances. Then oxygen, you have 2 times 3, 6, plus 4, 10. Here you have 4, 2 times 3, 6, so we also have 10 oxygen. Sodium 2, sodium, because of this coefficient here, 2. Sulfur 1, sulfur 1. So now it is balanced. We can proceed. So barium has a valence of 2, which is in aqueous, barium nitrate. Then also we are using barium and sulfate to come up with barium sulfate. So this one is going to be SO4 2 minus, which is aqueous, to form barium sulfate, okay, which is a solid. So this is the ionic equation, if at all they ask you to come up with the ionic equation. Okay, now method of preparation. Method of preparation. Method of preparation. Remember I said that you prepare this one using precipitation. Now if the question comes that how do you prepare bariums, a dry, how can you obtain a pure dry sample of barium sulfate? A pure dry sample of barium sulfate. Now the method is just the same for all insoluble salts. Number 1, what you need to do is you mix the reactants, which is barium nitrate solution, barium nitrate solution with sodium sulfate solution. Sodium sulfate what? Solution. Okay, so you mix this in a beaker. Then second, after mixing them in a beaker, secondly, a white precipitate, a white PPT, which is precipitate of indicating barium, so of barium sulfate, which is BaSO4, barium sulfate will form. Okay, barium sulfate forms. Third step is allow this precipitate that is formed to settle. So allow the PPT precipitate to settle. Okay, allow the precipitate to settle. Okay, allow the precipitate to settle. Number 4, what you need to do after allowing the precipitate to settle, it's simple, just to filter. Now filter off the precipitate, the PPT, the precipitate. Not only filtering off, but also make sure you wash the precipitate. Wash it with distilled water. With distilled water. Why are you washing the precipitate with distilled water? in order to remove any amount of sodium nitrate. Any amount of sodium nitrate, okay, left. Listen, look at the product here. When they react, when barium nitrate and sodium sulfate react, we are only interested in this, but sodium nitrate is also produced. So this one is white precipitate. This is the white precipitate that is formed. Sodium nitrate is a solution, so you clean this to remove any trace of sodium nitrate. That is the fourth step. Now after cleaning, after washing, what do? The fifth step, you dry the precipitate, PPT, dry the precipitate on the filter paper. After drying the precipitate on the filter paper, then you've done. The sixth and the last step will be, after drying it, a pure sample, in fact a pure dry sample, according to the question, a pure dry sample of barium sulfate forms. So this is the method of preparation. This is the actual process. So let's look at the question from exam. So we can answer a number of questions from the exam based on what we've covered. So far, we can look at a number of examination questions. Okay. So look at this examination question, which says barium sulfate is an insoluble salt. True. Describe briefly how a pure dry sample of barium sulfate can be prepared using sodium sulfate as one of the reagents. This is the answer, and it's 5 marks. So this is the answer, like I've explained earlier on. The method is that you should know the method, which is precipitation, and you should know the reagents. And they're saying using sodium sulfate. Sodium sulfate is one of the reactants. Sodium sulfate, then the other reactant will be barium nitrate. Okay? So they've said using sodium sulfate because you can also use sulfuric acid. Like I said here, you can also use sulfuric acid, which is H2SO4 as the chemical formula for sulfuric acid. So this is the process. Mix the reactants barium nitrate and with silver sulfate in a beaker. After mixing them, a white precipitate of barium sulfate will form. Okay? Then allow the precipitate to settle. Then filter off the precipitate and wash it with distilled water. Why are you washing it with distilled water? To remove any amount of sodium nitrate left. Okay? Then dry sample precipitate will form on the not dry sample. You dry the precipitate on the filter paper. After this, then the final step is that the barium sulfate will form. A pure dry sample of barium sulfate will form. That's the answer to this question. Let's look at another similar question from a different paper.